to talk about tree physiology and drought. So this is part of our SFEC and University of Minnesota Extension Forestry webinar series. For those of you that are joining us online, you know the WebEx system. It's up there. If you want to send a question or a comment to Rebecca, we'll be relaying questions to Rebecca here in Green Hall on the St. Paul campus at the University of Minnesota. So send those in the chat area. Should be located in the bottom right of the WebEx system, and then we'll forward those to Rebecca. And so with that, I think I'll turn it over to Rebecca and she can get us started today.
All right. Provide a microphone. Okay, hopefully the sound is good. We were having some issues before. Thanks for coming. Thanks for joining online. It's going to be a pretty broad overview, review for people who have had tree phys. Want to start out just giving a bit of context, especially in the realm of Minnesota and thinking about drought. This is the drought report from a week ago. This is updated, I think, daily at NOAA's site. It doesn't look like we're in much of a drought period, but generally drought occurs on a 5 to 10 year rotation here in Minnesota. So our forests ecosystems can expect to experience some sort of drought fairly regularly within the state. And so this is a concern, and this is something that we need to be thinking about in terms of stressors to our forests. So before we get started really talking about some of the physiological strategies that trees cope with drought, we really need to remind ourselves or learn how water moves in plants, because that's really a critical piece of this. And to do that, we need to learn or remember the concept of water potential, because water potential really dictates where the water wants to go within a tree or in any system. So water potential is a measure of where the water wants to go. It's based on two different factors: solute concentration, so how much salts and other compounds are in that water influencing it, and then pressure. So any pressure on that water that is influencing its movement. And in plants, that pressure is due to pressure from the actual cell walls on the water. And water potential is made up of these two things and really determines where the water goes. And so free water moves from regions of higher water potential to regions of lower water potential. So that's something to keep in your minds. We go from higher to lower. So what does it mean to have higher or lower water potential? So we're going to use this little graphic of water in a tube. And the blue water is pure water, and then those green dots represent something in that water. So a solute concentration in that water, salt or some other dissolved thing. And water potential is indicated by this symbol psi. I'll hopefully point that out to folks online. Psi. So psi P is the pressure, and psi S is the solute, and then this is overall. So we always start with a base of pure water, which is 0 megapascals, and you all don't have to worry exactly what a megapascal is. It's a measure of that pressure. And so in this case, we have 0 pressure potential on this side of the tube, but we have some solutes leading to this more negative water potential. So which way is the water going to move in this system? Remember, we go from higher to lower. So which direction? So we're going to be moving towards the side with the green dots. Let's see if you're right. There we go. Okay. All right. So next one, we have pure water. We have a pressure potential of 0.23. We have a solute of negative 0.23. And so overall, this is 0. Where's the water going to go in this one? Nowhere. People online, you can type in if you want to. It'll pop up on the screen, your answer. Correct. Nowhere. Okay, next one. Let's look at number C. So here we have our pressure potential. We're applying some pressure. We also have some solute. And so we have this 0 and 0.07. So which way is the water going to go here? Towards the solute side, or towards the pure water side. Last one. Guys, get the drill. Which direction is it going to move in this one? Higher to lower. So we're going to be going that way. Okay. Any questions about just general water potential and where water goes? Okay, so these water potentials are really important to think about because they dictate how water moves in plants. And so water potentials tend to be high in the soil. We move from the soil into the root hairs, into the cortex, into the xylem, move up the xylem. I've got to remember people online. Up through the xylem, into the leaf and the leaf mesophyll, out the stomata and into the atmosphere. And so we're moving across down this gradient from higher to lower, with the atmosphere having the most negative water potential. And that atmospheric water potential is really this driving force that's pulling water out of the plant, which I just gave away my next slide. So the question, one question that occupied folks who worked on tree phys for a long time is, how the heck does water move, right? Up through the plant. Like, how do we get water from the soil to the top of a tree, right? And the example I like to use is, have you ever seen, a fire engine and a pumper truck? And if you go up on the ladder with your hose, you're moving water to, 2 stories above the ground. How does a pumper truck get water to come out of that hose, 2 stories above the ground? Anyone know? How does that water move?
Pressure.
Pressure. Where does that come from?
Air pressure.
Like a big engine, right? That truck is like a huge pumping engine. Like the fire truck itself provides that power. Where's the power for this? Right? Like, in some ways it's totally amazing that we can, to get water out the top of a hose 2 stories high, we need a fire truck sized pump to push it. And yet a tree moves gallons and gallons of water a day through the plant body. Like, there's no big mechanical, powerful fire truck sized pump. So how do they do it? How does water move up in trees? Passively. This passive movement. There's no active, mechanical pump moving this water. So there were 3 major hypotheses for passive movement in the history of tree physiology. 1, root pressure. So that water's pushed up from the roots. The second was capillary action. So that action of water molecules sticking to the edges of a thin tube as a way of moving it. And then the third, the cohesion tension theory, which means that this water is basically pulled like a rope out of the stomata. And it's this latter one that has held up to testing. But I want to go through the 3 of these because I think it's important as a foundational basis to think about drought, to understand how water moves in trees. So root pressure. Root pressure, water gets pushed up from the roots. We have low water potential in root shells, and water flows in from the soil. This generally happens at night, so the stomata is closed. There's no pulling force. There's no force pulling it out. And this pressure from inflow pushes water up. This can move water maximum 3 to 6 feet. So this explains for small things, but not for large trees. I don't know if people have ever seen this phenomenon, herbaceous plants. Has anyone ever seen this, where you see these little droplets on the tips of the leaves? It's called guttation, and it's created by that root pressure where the liquid water there's that pressure up at night, and there's no place for it to go, so they ooze out these little channels at the tips of the leaves. Okay, so the second explanation is capillary action, and this is an example of just showing how the diameter of your tube influences how high that water column can go. And this is related to this property of water that it sticks to itself, and then it also sticks to surfaces. And because of capillary action, you can see that these thinner tubes can raise the water levels. However, capillary action, well, it's important because it creates the relationships between the water molecules that stick to each other through cohesion and stick to the walls through adhesion. Alone, it is not sufficient to explain this water movement. So this is happening in xylem cells. But you need a force to pull that water out of the plant, and that force is transpiration. So this tension is created through evaporation from the leaf surface out into the atmosphere. This is an incredibly strong force that then pulls along the rest of the water through this hydrogen bonding, through that kind of cohesion of the water to each other. So this is called the cohesion tension theory, and is the main explanation. And one of the ways that I like to think about it is that this water is like a rope or a chain inside of the plant, and the force of the evaporation out of the leaf is that force that's pulling that chain of water up through the plant and out of the leaves, moving water through the plant. And so this is just that same graphic, but with some of these water potentials, showing that you might have -8 here, outside -100. So this can be like that creates a very, very strong pulling force that moves that water out. All right. Any questions about cohesion tension, general water movement? Why my necklace is choking me. Questions online?
I haven't seen any questions online. If you do have them, feel free to type them into the chat area, and we can get them to Rebecca. Okay,
so question for you all. Why do plants need water? Why do we worry about drought? Why is drought a bad thing? Why is it a stressor? Why do plants need water? Photosynthesis, all right? Says Dr. Edgar in the audience. Photosynthesis. You need water for photosynthesis? Other ideas. Why do plants need water, or why is drought a stressor for plants? Desiccation. All right, so cells need water both to carry out photosynthesis, but other cellular processes, and cells need water to keep their shape, right? Plants don't have bones. That water is what gives it shape. Other ideas. Nutrients. That water is the conduit for moving nutrients, for moving other kinds of hormones and signals. One of the other reasons that people haven't said, but I think is important about drought being a negative thing, is that drought has the potential to break that chain, right? And so we're worried about one of the biggest stressors of droughts on trees is that drought can disrupt water transport, and thus water doesn't get to the parts of the plant that it needs to do all those things that you listed. And I just want to show, if I can get this to run, this video demonstrating this. Uh-oh. Matt.
Will be risky.
Okay, so I didn't see that sign. Hopefully this is,
And then on the lower left.
Transpiration.
there we go. Uh-oh. Maybe this isn't gonna work. Let's try again. Because I just want it to go straight into, I don't want it to download the file. Okay, folks, you don't get to see the cool cavitation video unless I can copy link location.
There you go.
Let's try that. And then if I can figure out how to use this different Apple paste, shoot. This is my Apple-ness. Copy.
You want to paste?
Click, yeah, I pressed the wrong button. I pressed, here we go. Oh, here we go. Are you guys ready for this?
Oh.
You're ready.
Oh, so close and yet so far. Oh well, all right. I can send people the link. It's pretty cool. I'll just do an interpretive dance of it, right? So basically, water moves up xylem. You get an air bubble in the xylem. So think of this tube, air bubble in the xylem. Water can't move through that tube anymore. And so generally, if there's other tubes, it diverts up through the other tubes. But if you get too many tubes clogged up, then that water ceases to move vertically through the plant. Okay, so there was a stomate video too. So why do we care about water? Water is important because it basically moves things through the plants and basically is important for all aspects of function. One of the issues with water movement is that in order to protect the xylem from having those air bubbles happen, one of the ways plants protect is by closing their stomates. But when they close their stomates, no CO2 goes in. Or if they totally close them, or even if they reduce them, it reduces the amount of CO2. And so there's this inherent trade-off in terms of getting that water to move. You need your stomates open. That also gives you CO2 for photosynthesis. And so drought processes reduce the aperture or close it, which reduces photosynthesis. So of course I got to put photosynthesis in here just to remind everyone that photosynthesis basically takes light and water, here we go, together to create chemical energy. And then that chemical energy drives this cycle that turns CO2 into sugars. And if people don't think about this as the most amazing process in the entire world, they should, because, you know, it's an amazing thing to turn light and water and CO2 into sugar. All right, so plants need water. Drought creates problems. It doesn't allow photosynthesis. It can interrupt. It can interrupt water flow. So what strategies do trees use in order to avoid or cope with drought? How do trees persist in the face of droughts that can vary from small to severe? And there's two kind of major strategies for drought. You either tolerate the drought, so you have strategies that allows you to continue to function, continue to grow and survive, or only survive, sometimes maybe you don't grow during those conditions, or you avoid it. So strategies that basically keep the plant from experiencing the drought itself. All right, so I'm going to start by walking through some drought avoidance strategies. The first one is just close your stomates, right? Number one response when soil moisture conditions or atmospheric air conditions get stressful and challenge the plant's water system is to close the stomates, which means suddenly that pulling force isn't there, the water's not moving through the plant, you're not taking up water, thus you're not actually seeing that the soil water conditions are extremely low. So close stomates. And we know that this comes with consequences, right? No photosynthesis. So I call closing the stomates a short-term strategy, because when stomates close, a lot of the functions of the plant, metabolism, respiration, whatnot, continue to operate. And they can operate for a period of time based on carbon reserves within the plant itself, but eventually the plant will run out of those stored carbon reserves if those stomates remain closed for too long. And this is one of two kind of major hypotheses for the pretty widely now observed drought-related tree mortality that has been happening in forest ecosystems globally. So one of those is that they close their stomates and eventually they've really run out of carbon to just maintain cellular function while they're sitting around waiting for moisture conditions. Deep roots. So another way to avoid is to basically get your water from a source that is constant. So changing, this is less physiological, I guess, and more a morphological strategy where roots seek groundwater sources and thus are really buffered from those drought conditions. Store water. This is an extreme example of a baobab tree, but trees have water storage tissues, and that water storage can basically create a buffer and capacitance against drought, and thus allow trees to avoid drought. And then another approach that involves basically delivering your own water to your roots is something called hydraulic lift. And here's another one of those, wow, our plant's really super cool phenomena. So what happens with hydraulic lift, what we normally see is in the daytime, the plant is photosynthesizing, stomates are open, it is taking water from the soil layers near the surface and then deep. But with hydraulic lift, at the nighttime, you have a lot of water down here, you have high water potentials, but then you have low water potentials, and you may also have some root pressure action happening that moves deep water up, and then it kind of exudes out the roots in the surface area around the roots. So basically the plant is water is moving from deep soil groundwater layers and being released by the plants in the soil surface area. And then that is available in the daytime for that tree to use. It's also available for other plants that are associated with this tree. So especially in the xeric environments, trees that are hydraulic lifters tend to act in some ways as nurse plants, and they have other plants associated with them that are benefiting from that. One of the species in our area that does this is sugar maple. So sugar maple is a hydraulic lifter. Any questions?
So why would a plant evolve towards becoming a hydraulic lifter?
Good question.
Rebecca, can you repeat the question?
Yep. So a question from the room here is, why would a plant evolve to become a hydraulic lifter? and I don't know the answer to that, but I can speculate wildly in that it could be related to the soil profile of water if they're in an area that has groundwater sources, but they also have morphology where they have a extensive fine root system at the soil surface that's important for nutrient and water uptake. That it may also have something to do, obviously the trees may differ in their root morphology and influence this. But I would guess it was an environmental selection pressure. I keep forgetting to look at the camera, folks online. All right, so how about drought tolerance? What are some characteristics associated with drought tolerance? Generally, drought tolerance would be you can withstand dry conditions through either minimizing water loss but maintaining that flow, or through other characteristics. So one of the first things in terms of minimizing water loss is to have thick cuticles. So things that tend to be in drier environments tend to have these thicker cuticles. The other way to tolerate drought is to have a excuse me, a low water potential at which turgor is lost. All right, so what do I mean by this? So this is a graph just showing a turgid cell, right? Water's in it, it's holding up, it's functional. As water gets lost from the cell, that structural support that the water causes is lost and the cell collapses and loses shape and loses function. So one of the things that trees that are more drought tolerant can do is they maintain this state, this turgid state, at more negative water potential. So you can have, remember that water potential is a kind of a measure of where the water can go, and the more negative the water potential, the more actually stress there is on the plant, on the xylem, on the leaves. So often plants will have thresholds at which they close their stomates, or where that cavitation I talked about before occurs, or where the cells start collapsing. And so drought tolerant species tend to have kind of more negative. They can withstand drier conditions and maintain the turgor of their cells. So how do they do this? One of the ways they do it is having thick cell walls. And so the example that I like to use is if you think about a balloon, right, that's full of air, and as you let air out of a balloon, it loses its shape, right? It has thin walls. Now think about a basketball or a football. You can let air out of a football or a basketball and it still maintains its shape. And anyone who is a football fan knows that there was a big controversy related to, deflating of a football, that we couldn't see that it was somewhat deflated. So, turgor, thick cell walls play a role in the cell being able to maintain its shape as it loses water and as those tensions get more strong. Another way is shifting the morphology that influences water loss. So I talked about waxy cuticles, having a thick epidermis that doesn't have stomates, so having stomates only on one side of the leaf, and then having special morphology that put those stomates in what you might call stomatal crypts. Again, like plants are cool, right? Wow, hydraulic lift, photosynthesis, stomatal crypts, they're like little pockets that the stomates are in, and you can imagine that the kind of the humidity here and that driving force to pull water out might be slightly less here. So this will allow these plants to maintain those open stomates and maintain that water flow, even if the air water potential, the air moisture is a lot lower. Okay. Another way that plants influence and tolerate drought is through characteristics related to their xylem. So just a reminder of what xylem is. So xylem is made up of several different tissues, tracheids, which occur in all vascular plants. And tracheids are narrow. So there's you can imagine that narrow things, there's more of those, the walls for that rope of water to rub against and more resistance to that flow of water. And then the water has to go through these pits, so that also slows water movement down, which can be a good thing in drought conditions, for example. Vessels occur only in angiosperms, so our flowering plants, they tend to be wider, so you can get much more water flow. They tend to have perforations in the ends or even open ends that reduce the resistance and allow more water to flow through them, which means you can deliver more water. But if you are under conditions of low water stress or low water, these can be less safe and more prone to cavitation and getting air bubbles, or just be one of those exacerbating the problem because the plant needs to move a lot of water, and as their water requirements are high, so as drought conditions develop, they're more likely to start seeing negative effects because of that high demand. And this basically is incorporated into kind of vascular tissue that's a mix of tracheids and vessels. And these are where those air bubbles form and can propagate through and create barriers to water flow. All right, are you ready for the next, like, plants are the coolest things on the planet slide? So gymnosperm, so our conifers, things that have these tracheids, also have, some of them have this very cool anatomy of those pits between the xylem. And so remember, those pits help water to flow, but if you get cavitation, if you get an air bubble in there, they're also the conduits that those air bubbles spread. And so one of the things that plants adjust their kind of physiology and characteristics of xylem is to try and prevent that spreading of those air bubbles. And this pit anatomy is one way to do it. So this is like looking straight on at a pit, and you see that there's this solid mass in the middle that they call the torus right here. And then you have all these kind of little stringy things that are pervious on the sides. So this allows the water to move through. When an air bubble gets into a vessel that has these, so here's an example here where it's open and the water flows through around the torus and through those things into the next vessel. If an air bubble comes in here, that torus moves against the edge, right? So this is that pit. This is the cell wall. This is this structure that we're looking at here. It gets shoved against it, and the torus blocks that pit, right? So now the torus is in line with the cell wall edges, and that air bubble can't spread. Water can't spread either, but this is a really a strategy with which to contain these cavitation or embolism or air bubbles from spreading and damaging other xylem cells and thus blocking off water flow. Does that make sense, people? Isn't that super cool? There's a question online.
Can an individual tracheid or vessel recover from a cavitation event?
Yeah, yes. So there are ways that plants can recover from cavitation. They can the air bubbles, if they're small, can redissolve back into the water, and then the water flow is resumed. It really depends on the extent of the embolism. For example, many plants get air bubbles after winter because of freezing and thawing. As water freezes inside those xylem cells, air comes out of solution. If you've ever looked at an ice cube in your ice cube tray, there's like water bubbles in those. And when that thaws, those air bubbles tend to coalesce and create bigger bubbles and can cut off xylem. And in some species, especially with those big wide vessels that can move things, those big wide vessels tend to get big air bubbles that clog them up, and tend to not be able to recover. So oaks, for example, generally tend to be totally cavitated by spring, and that xylem, very little of it becomes functional again. So new xylem is actually grown that then the water moves through from year to year. Dave.
Question, yeah, what's the mechanism whereby the tourist recognizes there's an air bubble there? I mean,
It's
does anybody
pressure.
Explain that?
It's air pressure.
Air pressure.
So it's a
pushes it-
physical process. The air pressure pushes it up
pushes
against the
it up
side.
against the side.
Yep, good question. So the question was, how does the tourist know to move? It doesn't. It's a purely physical process that the air bubble creates pressure that pushes that up against the cell
And
walls.
so if it was a bigger air bubble, that would happen faster or?
Possibly, yeah. Yep.
Okay. A
Yep.
little Tiny air.
I hadn't actually thought about that.
I wonder if anybody's tested that out.
So does the air bubble get into the system from cuts and wounds and?
So the air bubble actually will happen if that rope breaks from the tension. So imagine if you're holding like a string in your hand, and it's a flexible or thin string. If you pull hard enough, you can break it, right? You got a piece of, right? Piece of yarn or something. If you put a large enough tension on it, you'll break that. Same thing happens with this kind of rope of water molecules, that if that tension, that pulling force gets too strong, it can break it. So that's one of the issues with kind of that, what I talked about initially with water moving from higher to lower water potential. That's critical for the water to move. But if that pulling force gets too strong, it can break.
What would make it so strong?
Really, really negative water potential. So really dry air conditions that then are being propagated into the mesophyll and creating too strong of a driving force.
So then is it also like a spool? So like you're unspooling the string so the water from the ground is like feeding the string? So if that runs out, then you're...
Right, yes. And so that's, the other piece of it is if it can break on the bottom if you got a pulling force and then there's nothing to pull, or if the tensions get really strong in the root area where where there's not water to pull out. All the water in the soil, for example, is bound to the soil and not free to be pulled out. If the plants are still trying to pull, then that force becomes very strong. Any other questions? Okay, so what can you do? What are things you can do to reduce drought stress? Anyone?
Water.
Water, okay, so you could water. Yep, I've done that with tree seedlings.
Mulch.
Mulch to reduce kind of evaporation of water. It maintains soil moisture. What else can you do?
Pruning.
Pruning to reduce the kind of canopy level leaf area that's pulling water out. Sure.
Shade.
Shade, okay.
Plant selection,
Pardon?
plant selection.
Species choice, what species you choose. Anyone online?
Spacing of trees.
Spacing of trees, great. Okay, other ideas.
Location, thinking of like wind desiccation or protection.
Okay,
during
sure. So
winter.
wind can kind of take away, can create a strong driving force by removing what's called the boundary layer that forms on the leaf that protects those keeps those stomates from their direct contact with the broader atmosphere.
Improve soil.
Improve soil.
The type of rooting for the species, whether it's just
Okay, so-
pepper?
Yep, so species selection and selecting characteristics. All right, my first slide is completely not on these, but I'm going to show you some examples of all those. My first slide is actually related to that, how frequently we have droughts, right? 5 to 10 year interval. Those droughts are predicted to potentially become more common because of our CO2 emissions. So one of my number one thing to think about reducing drought stress on trees is try and reduce where we can control drought, the droughts that might come in the future, do so. And one of the ways to do that is to get us on a lower emission scenario than we currently are right now. But in terms of the direct things you can do with trees, one of the main things, and the person online said this, was controlling spacing. So thinning is a major tool that forest managers can use to reduce impacts of drought. So here's just an example of an unthinned forest from a pretty high density growing stock conditions, and then another where forest is thinned. And there's been a fair amount of work, especially coming out of Tony D'Amato's lab, that has looked at tree rings. And in tree rings are really a record of good and bad growing years, and often good and bad growing years are related to drought. And so you can see in this slide a narrow ring that likely was set down during a drought year, a year where that tree was really challenged in terms of its ability to gain carbon and grow, and then a wide ring in a year potentially when that plant had enough resources. So how do we give trees more resources? Well, one of the ways is to reduce the number of trees that are competing or trying to use those resources. And work that Tony and his students have done have basically gone and looked at tree ring width reductions during drought years for trees grown at different spacing, and basically showed that that as you have lower density forests, perhaps through management practices like thinning, those trees get less growth reductions when exposed to a drought. So they're able to, in some ways, not see the drought so much because there's really more water for each tree to go around, even though there's less overall. Does that make sense? So another way to get at this is to do more structurally diverse harvests. And so thinning, but also combined with creating more openings. In our part of the world, openings and gaps tend to have more water availability because they're like super low density, right? There's no trees there. And so these tend to be places of high resource availability. The other thing that having more structurally diverse forests does is it creates different types of microenvironments that support species that have different sensitivities to drought and to drought conditions. Another role that can be played is by controlling competing vegetation. So this is an undergrad student of mine some years ago in a red pine forest that was just chock full of hazel. And what we found for even our most drought tolerant tree in this area is that diameter growth shown here, and this is control, this is a thinned, and these are a couple of gaps that while reducing the canopy increased diameter growth overall in all of these, reducing the understory as well further enhanced diameter growth. And this wasn't specifically a drought study, but this was a study basically controlling how many neighbors and who are using those resources. And by releasing those resources, we see larger gains in terms of growth. And I would hypothesize based on the tree ring work that these tree seedlings that were in these areas where they had less canopy trees competing with them and less understory species would also show less growth reductions when faced with a drought period or a dry year. I actually have a student Matt and I have a student who's going to be testing this hypothesis with pine seedlings in this same system that this work was done. And then species choice. You all brought up this idea of you can choose species that are more resistant to drought, that have these characteristics related to their xylem, related to their cell walls and their leaf tissues, related to their rooting structures and whatnot that make them more suited to drought conditions, to growth and success in drought conditions, and to survival in drought conditions. So, to summarize, Minnesota, we tend to get droughts every 5 to 10 years. While precipitation has been increasing and is projected to increase, the frequency of that is expected to change, meaning we're more likely to have boom and busts of precipitation, and those busts are going to exacerbate drought impacts on our forests. Why do we care about drought? Because trees will lose their ability to transport water under drought conditions. They lose their ability to photosynthesize, and this results in growth reductions and in the more extreme cases, mortality. Trees cope with this through various physiological and morphological strategies that allow them to either avoid the drought or tolerate drought. And management can reduce drought stress through actions like thinning, gap creation, controlling competing vegetation, and what species they choose, among many other things that folks here also brought up when I kind of ask y'all to think about what we can do as managers. And with that, I thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take more questions. Dave?
Yeah, I had a question. If we could just remind us what some of the best choices might be in terms of drought-tolerant trees in particular,
Yep.
in sort of deciduous and some mixed or coniferous forests here
Yep.
in Minnesota.
Yeah, well, certainly jack pine and red pine are some of our most drought-tolerant coniferous species.
Mm-hmm.
And then the oaks are tend to be more drought tolerant than things like maples and basswoods and things from the more mesic forests.
And one would think this is especially important in urban environments where you have other stressors, and that thinking about this would be really, really key in species selection.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Ryan can talk more to this than I can, but urban areas are really stressful environments for many reasons, right? Both because there's small rooting space, which influences water, which influences nutrients, and you tend to also have more of a urban heat island effect, especially in the summer, and so you're going to have these stronger driving forces for water loss and less water. But there's also, in an urban area, there's more likelihood that people are going to are going to water, for example. Someone said, how do you reduce drought stress? Well, you water. Well, we don't do that in rural forests, but people do that in urban forests. Which helps, yeah. There was a question online I saw pop up.
Yeah, a couple questions online. One about crown ratio. I tend to think of live crown ratio being important for maintaining photosynthetic capacity. Is a good live crown ratio kind of a good indicator to manage water movement or maintain pressure differential?
Good question. So, there may be actually some competing issues there in terms of live crown ratio. So the higher your ratio, the higher your leaf area, the higher your photosynthesis to say respiratory tissues. So that's really positive in terms of carbon gain. But if you are thinking in terms of drought, the more leaf tissue you have, the more stomates you have, the more possibility you have for water loss out of those leaf tissues. And then if you are avoiding by closing stomates, that can be maybe a more important strategy if you have a lot of leaf area, but it also is a risk in terms of that running out of carbon because you have a lot of tissues that you're just trying to maintain basic function of based on your reserves. So I would say that thinking about crown ratios, there's some tension there in terms of carbon gain and growth versus kind of stress potential in drought.
Got another question about tree rings. Is there some type of index that explains how many rings per inch that might be measured to be desirable for different species? Some trees grow slower or faster. Didn't know if there was some type of guide to assume a drought year versus a non-drought year.
I do not know of any sort of guide. Generally, the way tree ring work is done, and I am not a tree ring person, although I think tree ring work is really super cool. But generally what folks do is they measure ring widths and then they correlate those ring widths to temperature or generally rainfall records, and then basically build a relationship between how much tree ring width changes with moisture availability to calibrate that. And generally it's based on species. So some species aren't that sensitive, and so there isn't signal in their tree rings of drought. And other species, they are very, very good signalers of drought in their tree rings.
Another one about canopy thinning. Is canopy thinning in unmanaged northern forests a drought response to create greater spacing? So
when trees have dieback. It could be, but the mechanism for crown dieback, if it's not a disease-related mechanism, right, where you have tissues that are maybe stressed and then diseased and die, if it's a drought-induced dieback, it's likely that you've gotten those air bubbles in the branches, and so water delivery doesn't go to the branches and those branches die. So it's more of a response to a stressor that's being driven by lack of water, and less of a preemptory kind of, sort of like it may serve to reduce water stress because you have less tissue there, but it's happening because those branches are dying because water flow has been cut off to them.
And one more, if water moves nutrients and generally pumps up, how do roots receive nutrition?
Well, the roots are the nutrients are coming through the roots from, and so they like get left there, right? And some of them get moved up. But another way to think about this, because it's not just nutrients and water that moves, but sap, phloem, sugars within the plant move through the plant, and sugars, whereas water is really directional on these water potential gradients, and generally they're going to go from the soil to tree to atmosphere pathway. Sugars in the plant move from sources, so where the sugars are being made, to sinks where those sugars need to be used. So they might go from a leaf to a growing tissue. And so they're more basically that source to sink, and it doesn't matter if it's up or down. So growing roots, you're going to get movement of materials into those roots through source sink dynamics to build those new roots, for example. And that's a different tissue that I didn't talk about today called phloem.
I'm
Ryan.
trying to understand the mechanism for how stomata know to shut down.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if it's just the pressure in the vessels goes down. So that.
Yeah, so how do stomates know? It's a mixture between those pressures going down, the tension's becoming greater, right? The negative water potentials being greater, but it's also a hormonal signal. So ABA signal is upregulated under these conditions and signals those stomates to close, and they close by basically influencing their turgor that makes them close together. And I do not, so I'm not deep in the stomatal literature, but I have a sense that people are still kind of asking questions about those controls and trying to work out kind of the mechanisms of stomatal control. And if anyone in this room knows more than me, you should just jump in, because we all have expertise.
I did a talk on xeriscaping, and this is more on, maybe on herbaceous plants, but that there are some plants, and I don't know what they are, that the CO2, that the stomata close during the day and they open at night.
Yeah, so those are succulents that use a drought strategy called crassulacin acid metabolism, or CAM. It is not common in trees, if at all. Maybe some shrubs use CAM. I know some shrubs use CAM, but what CAM does is partitions the process between day and night. And so in the day, the plant keeps its stomates closed, doesn't lose water, takes that light energy and converts it to kind of this intermediary product that gets stored in the vacuole. Okay, so the amount of carbon you can gain depends on how big your vacuoles are and how much storage space you have in those cells. And then at night, what's in the vacuole comes out, gets returned into CO2 and goes through the regular kind of Calvin cycle. So on that photosynthesis diagram, there's like the light part and the dark part, and those dark parts happen at night, where they can have open stomates.
Other questions? Well, I'm not seeing any online. Let's thank Rebecca for folks that are joining online. We'll send an email with a recording to this, and we'll find the links that for those videos that Rebecca was showed. We tried on our laptops too and had some issues, so we'll sort that out. There is a link to continuing education credits that Madison Rodman should have put in the chat area. Our webinar next month is on silviculture practices and logging sector, kind of the health of the logging sector. So Charlie Bland and Marcella Woodmuller-Campioni will be sharing some results from surveys in next month's webinar. So with that, we'll sign off. Thanks for joining us today.